We have been waiting for this day for months now. It is official. Pitchers and catchers report today. Spring training is here.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. On the show today, we're talking all things spring training. In the first segment, I'll go over some of the key dates to know about the upcoming schedule for spring training. We'll also go through some key storylines to follow throughout Mets camp. In the second segment, I'm going to talk about some of the position battles that are about to unfold as the Mets will look to finalize a 26-man roster by opening day. And then in the final segment, we're going to go through a long list of non-roster invites spotlighting some of the more interesting minor league signs the Mets made this offseason, as well as some of the top prospects who were just invited to big league camp. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. This is the #1 daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find some of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. All right, so let's talk about the calendar for the next 6 weeks here. The first big date is today, Wednesday, February 11th. Pitchers and catchers are officially supposed to report for the New York Mets. On Monday next week, the 16th, it'll be the first full squad workout. So everybody should be there by the beginning of next week. And by next Saturday, we're going to be watching some baseball games. First game of Grapefruit League action for the Mets on Saturday. They're going to play 29 games over the span of about 4 weeks. If you want to watch Juan Soto, Mark Vientos, who else? Clay Holmes, Noel McLean. I don't know if those guys will pitch, but if you want to watch some of the notable players that the Mets have, they'll be playing in the World Baseball Classic. The last week of February is your time to do it. The World Baseball Classic starts on March 5th. I believe guys will start reporting once we get into March to their World Baseball Classic teams. And I'm going to do a full World Baseball Classic preview once we get a little bit closer to the Classic. That will begin again on the 5th. So I'll tell you about where everybody's playing and how many guys are leaving the Mets to go play in the big tournament. Now, on March 19th, the Mets are going to play the Rays in the Spring Breakout. This is, I believe, the third annual Spring Breakout, which is where you have the top prospects from 2 different systems that all get together and play an exhibition game. It's a lot of fun. You'll get to see a full roster of Mets prospects playing in one game. It really is like the one chance you get to look at these guys all at the same time, from guys who are going to start the year in St. Lucie to guys who are going to start the year in Syracuse. So it's a lot of fun. Definitely a day you should circle on your calendar. Try to watch that game. Usually it's airing on the MLB.TV app, or sometimes MLB Network will have it. So definitely look out for that. And then the final game of the Grapefruit League for the Mets is going to be March 22nd in Jupiter against the Marlins. They'll then have 3 days off, and then opening day is going to be March 26th against the Pittsburgh Pirates at Citi Field. We're only 43 days away from opening day, which is so awesome. Can't wait for the baseball season to really be back, but spring training is not a bad appetizer. Couple of key storylines to look out for over these coming weeks. Guys playing new positions, I think, is probably the most interesting of storylines. You got Bo Bichette over at third base. You got Jorge Polanco over at first base. You got Brett Baty at first base and in right field. If you missed it, I did a show yesterday after David Stern's press conference breaking down some of the key talking points. And the biggest one was that Juan Soto is now a left fielder. The Mets are going to move him over there. He's playing left field for the Dominican Republic in the World Baseball Classic, as they have Tatis over in right. And Carlos Mendoza has been talking to Soto throughout the offseason. He's very comfortable playing in either corner. And so the Mets are going to put him in left field, not only for this season, probably for the rest of his career when he's an outfielder, which might be, 5 more seasons. So he'll be the left fielder. Carson Benge likely becomes the long-term right fielder, but that is a position battle we will discuss a little bit in the next segment. And since I mentioned it, that is one of the storylines to watch, is how Carson Benge is going to adjust to, I believe it's his first big league camp, right? I can't remember if he got an official invite last year. I don't believe he would have, because that was technically his first full season in the minor leagues. So I would assume that he did not get an invite last year. I remember Jet Williams was in camp. Brian Clifford was in camp, but I don't, and I guess probably Drew Gilbert, right? And Acuna. So those were the guys that, and actually Acuna was already on the roster at that stage after getting called up for Lindor in September. Regardless, Carson Benge is going to be the guy to watch because he is going to be fighting for a job and there's going to be a lot of eyes on him. He's going to get a ton of playing time, I think. So Carson Benge, definitely a big storyline to watch. Another one, the Freddy Peralta extension talk. That's going to be a little undercurrent that we're going to be following throughout spring training. At some point, will Freddy Peralta and his representatives with Aces get in a room with David Stearns and Steve Cohen and hammer out a deal? I am right now still expecting that an extension gets done, and that's a big storyline to follow. Now, injuries is, of course, always going to be a series of storylines any spring. And we already got the first one. Again, like I said, I did a full show on what David Stearns said in his press conference. The other big news item was Francisco Lindor having an injury to the hamate bone in his left hand. That is a bone that we saw last year. Francisco Alvarez broke it. You get a surgery, you get the bone removed, and then typically there's not any problems after it. It's a 6-week timetable for the injury. Again, I spent more time at length discussing it on that other stream yesterday, but the expectation is still that even if Lindor needs to have the surgery, because the timetable is 6 weeks and they have 6 weeks, he'd still be ready for opening day. So we'll be following that. We're going to be following, of course, the rotation. Can they stay healthy this year? Last year, Frankie Montas, Sean Manaea, Paul Blackburn, all those guys went down in camp, and all of a sudden guys like Griffin Canning and Tyler McGill, who weren't expected to make the rotation, found their way into a 5-man rotation along with Clay Holmes, David Peterson, and Kodai Senga. Speaking of Senga, what does he look like? What does Sean Manaea look like? Those two guys, I think, are really interesting. They couldn't have ended the year on a lower low than where they finished. David Peterson too, but I'm not as worried about that one. But seeing how, if those guys can put up some good results while spring training performance doesn't typically matter, you're going to feel a lot better about Kodai Senga if he is breezing through spring training rather than getting rocked in spring training. So we'll see how those guys look. I think that's another very big storyline to follow. Other than that, the biggest storylines, of course, are all the position battles that are going to take place. And that's where we're going to pick things up in a minute here. I'm going to go through the different areas where there's going to be some competition, as roster spots are certainly up for grabs in Mets camp. Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. Hiring isn't just about finding somebody that's willing to take the job. It's about finding the right person with the right background who can actually help your business move forward. And if you want candidates who match what you're looking for, Indeed sponsored jobs is the move. Because instead of hoping the right person stumbles across your post, Indeed's going to help you with quality candidates by boosting your job listing to the people that fit your specific criteria, like skills, certifications, and location. That's what I like about Indeed. You can get specific and target exactly what you need. It saves you time because you're spending less energy sorting through mismatches, and instead you're just getting the right candidates for you. And sponsored jobs, your post gets seen by candidates who are actually a fit. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all the boxes with Indeed sponsored jobs. Listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves. And Indeed, that is at Indeed.com/podcast. Again, that's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. To watch on YouTube today, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 16,000 subscribers. And I would love to get there by opening day. So I do appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. Let's talk about some of the position battles in camp. I think the most interesting competition to follow is the one that's going to take place, what we thought was out in left field, but now moves over to right. And that's seeing if Carson Benge can hold off everybody else and actually win the job to be the Mets starting right fielder. He's clearly the front runner. David Stearns has been pushing him out in front all offseason, but now he's got to prove it. And I know David Stearns in his presser yesterday said that they will not be going strictly off game results and performance to decide some of these position battles, but it goes a pretty long way still if a guy's having a red hot camp. If Carson Benge is swinging the bat well, there's going to be a very easy decision at the end of camp. If Carson Benge is striking out a ton and looking overmatched by big league pitching, well, then you might have to think about putting him in Syracuse to start the season. And then all of a sudden you're looking at Brett Baty and saying, all right, well, Brett Baty is the best bat that we can stick in right field, but can he play right field? I understand that it would have been easier for him to play left. I talked about this again on yesterday's show where I broke down the change for Soto. Juan Soto is, he leaves such a low bar in right field that I don't think it's that tough for Brett Baty to meet that bar, but you don't want to be in the same situation where the Mets felt like they were at the end of last season, where they didn't like their outfielders in either corner. Now, the difference is now you have a true center fielder in Luis Robert, where last year when Tyrone Taylor was out there, sure, you had a really good center fielder, but when Jeff McNeil was out there, when Cedric Mullins was out there, not as good of an outfield. So you already did improve in that way, but the Mets aren't going to put Brett Baty out there if he can't play right at all. He just looks atrocious. They're not going to do that. So seeing how Baty makes that transition is going to be a very interesting part of that competition. Again, if we're just grading it purely off the bats, I would even say Brett Baty, just because of the big league experience he has, would be a better fit for the Mets than Carson Benge. The difference is Carson Benge can be elite defensively in right field, and he might be able to bridge that gap to Brett Baty a lot sooner than we might think, as he is a top 15 prospect in baseball heading into this season. Another name to mention, of course, is MJ Melendez. We talked about him a few days ago when the Mets signed him to that split contract. He is going to get a long look in camp to see if this change of scenery can maybe spark him, and he could give you another left-handed power bat that you can plug into that corner outfield spot. And if all else fails, Tyrone Taylor will be your default starting right fielder, which would give you an outstanding defense with Tyrone Taylor in right, Luis Robert in center, Simeon and Lindor up the middle. I mean, that would be a very good defensive team, but you'd obviously be lacking offensively with Tyrone Taylor getting a regular run. A couple other names to mention for that competition. Jose Ramos put together very similar numbers to MJ Melendez in the minor leagues last year, 18 homers in 102 games. A guy that can never quite, get close to the big league because he was with the Dodgers organization. But he played pretty well in AAA last year, hit 295, 359 on base, 557 slugging percentage with 8 home runs in 44 games. He's only 25 years old. Kind of look at him as this year's Alex Canario, and we'll see if he can stand out enough in spring to make an impression and actually make the team as a non-roster invite. The other option to discuss, we mentioned him the other day as well on the Melendez show, that is Jose Rojas, who was great last year with the Yankees in AAA. He hit 287, 379 on base, 599 slug, hit 32 homers and 35 doubles with 4 triples across 124 games played. So just awesome numbers. Drove in 105, even stole 15 bags. He's 33 years old. He's a former top prospect who has never established himself, but he's coming off a great season in the minor leagues. So he's definitely one more name to look out for. That conversation is going to bleed into the battle for the final bench spot, right? The Mets, I think, are more likely, in my opinion, to carry an outfielder than an infielder with that final bench spot. That is assuming that Francisco Lindor is healthy, but if he's not ready to go come opening day, you're obviously going to carry another infielder anyway to replace Lindor. So I think for now, I'm looking more towards guys that can plug in the outfield every now and then, or potentially guys that can do both. So we'll talk about some of the NRIs in the next segment that might fit that criteria. But along with Jose Rojas, Jose Ramos, MJ Melendez, Carson Benge, all those guys that are fighting for roster spots, I also think you have to mention Jared Young, who's coming off a really good season in Syracuse for the Mets and still on the 40-man roster, so he has a little bit of an inside track over some of the NRIs. Also, Ronnie Mauricio, you can't count him out. If he looks great this spring, he could find his way on the roster and he can eat into Mark Vientos' playing time at DH. You're not going to start Ronnie Mauricio over Bo Bichette at third, but you might, give him a day at third a week and give Bichette a DH day. You might put Mauricio at second base. You'd have to have a great camp to not start the season in Syracuse, or there'd have to be an injury. But Ronnie Mauricio definitely going to get a lot of playing time in the Grapefruit League at least, and we'll see what he looks like. There's an injury or two. We could see a competition at the back end of the Mets rotation. That competition would likely include Tobias Myers, Christian Scott, and Jonah Tong, with Tobias Myers the clear favorite, because I think the Mets would probably prefer starting Tong and Scott in AAA because for Scott, he hasn't pitched in a year in game action, so get him some looks against AAA lineups to get his feet under him. And for Jonah Tong, there's just things that he can still develop in the minor leagues. There's going to be obviously a huge competition for bullpen spots. It's clearly the biggest competition the Mets are going to have here. We know that Devin Williams is in the Mets bullpen, Luke Weaver, Brooks Raley, Luis Garcia. Those are your 4 locks. Good chance that Tobias Myers ends up in the pen if he does not crack the opening day rotation, and it's going to take a couple of injuries for him to crack the opening day rotation. So I think right there that might bring you to 5 relievers, but you still have 2 spots left if it is a 6-man rotation and 3 spots left if it's a 5-man rotation. So plenty of opportunities for guys to stand out, make an impression in camp, and win themselves a job on the big league roster. AJ Minter won't be back until May, so that's just another name to mention that the Mets will not have on opening day, and gives you another option or another spot that needs to be filled in the bullpen. On the 40-man roster, Huascar Brazaban is a favorite to make the team. Still has 1 option left, though, so the Mets could send him to the minor leagues. He'll also be playing for the Dominican Republic in the World Baseball Classic. Brian Hudson was a trade acquisition yesterday. Mentioned him on that live stream after the Stearns presser. He is coming off of a rough season in 2025, but was great in 2024. A 6'8" lefty with a very good sweeper. So we'll see if he ends up making the pen. He does not have any options, like I mentioned, so he is the favorite among the left-hand relievers. Interestingly enough, you go through the Mets 40, every single other reliever outside of Brian Hudson and the 4 locks that we mentioned, Devin Williams, Luke Weaver, Brooks Raley, and Luis Garcia, every other guy on the 40 has options. So the Mets have a lot of flexibility to let these competitions play out in camp, where they're not going to be, pigeonholed into carrying a certain, group of relievers just because they don't want to lose those arms and they're just out of options. So you can definitely see plenty of different guys factoring into the mix. You got Jonathan Pintaro, Justin Hagenman are both on the 40. You still have Dylan Ross, Austin Warren, Joey Gerber, who was picked up this offseason, and Alex Carrillo, all on the 40-man roster as well. Ross and Carrillo both added to the 40 last season. They were our Mets prospects. Austin Warren was part of the taxi squad up and down last year, and it did pitch pretty well. So that is all of the different position battles that we can see take place. In the rotation, there could be a competition at the back end depending on injuries. In the bullpen, there's obviously a wide-ranging competition with 3 or 4 spots available. And then you've got right field and a bench spot that are up for grabs for guys this spring training. In the final segment today, we're going to go through the list of non-roster invites. 29 players the Mets have invited to camp who are not on their 40-man roster. So we'll go through that list here in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The Winter Games are officially here, and if you're anything like us, you're locking in for events you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years. That's why following the Winter Games on FanDuel just makes sense. From medal counts to individual events to finding your angle on the sport you care about most, FanDuel is going to give you more ways than ever to stay connected to the action. The drama of curling matches can start slow and somehow get intense fast. Speed skating races can be decided by inches. Hockey games are going to feel different right from the opening faceoff. FanDuel will keep you engaged to the Olympic experience from start to finish. The Winter Games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day, and thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. You already live your team every day. Now it's time to take it up a level and go ad-free. Join the Everyday Club, and you're going to get Locked On Mets without the interruptions. You'll also get access to our Discord. We can chat to other Mets fans, as well as getting access to a merch shop. If you want to be part of our Everyday Club, you can find a link in the episode description, or you can go to lockedonmets.supercast.com. All right, so 29 non-roster invites. We're going to start it off on the position player front. I already mentioned Jose Rojas and Jose Ramos, the other outfielders in camp. You got Christian Pache, a glove-first center fielder who's never hit in the big leagues. And you got Ji-Hwan Bae, guy that gives you some versatility because he can play some second along with the outfield, and he does have some speed, but he's not great defensively, even though he's versatile, and he doesn't slug at all, and he has not had success in the big leagues. So I'm not too high on Ji-Hwan Bae. You have Greg Kessinger, Jackson Clough, and Christian Arroyo, who are all glove-first utility guys. Vidal Brujan is on the 40, but he's in a similar bucket to those three as far as guys that can make the team. If the Mets needed a backup shortstop on the roster, But more likely than not, I think they have a long shot of actually making it. You have Austin Barnes as an NRI, former Dodgers catcher. He's going to be battling it out for a backup catcher job that's only going to open up if there's an injury, because we know if the Mets are healthy, it'll be Alvarez as the starting catcher and Luis Torrens as the backup. You'll also have Hayden Sanger, who's on the 40-man roster, is a great defensive catcher, knows a lot of these pitchers, and he just makes more sense as the third catcher than Austin Barnes does. More likely than not, Austin Barnes is going to be in Syracuse, and you just sort of see if you need him throughout the season. Now, that brings us to some of the top prospects who were invited to camp on the position player side. Kevin Parada is back for a second camp. Parada, if you listen to the show for a long time, you know how I feel about Parada. Has been one of my least favorite prospects for some time. I will say he had a decent season last year, was above average offensively. He has made some strides defensively, but still isn't grading out or viewed as an above average catcher. Also hasn't come anywhere close to the power that he had in his final year in Georgia Tech before getting drafted, where he hit 26 home runs in 60 games. We just haven't seen that. Across his first 3 minor league seasons, Kevin Parada had 26 home runs. He had 11 last year, 108 games. The power just has not showed up the way the Mets expected when they drafted him in the first round. And I am not that high on the idea that he's going to be a part of the Mets' future. He was also Rule 5 draft eligible and nobody selected him. So we'll see what his season looks like in Syracuse this year. Chris Suero is a catcher that I'm way higher on and definitely more excited to see what he does this spring. He's coming off a great performance in the Arizona Fall League, where he posted a 920 OPS and hit 5 bombs and stole 8 bases in 15 games. Suero hit 16 home runs last year between AA and high A, spent more time in high A, 41 games in AA. He also stole 35 bags. So a really solid season for Suero. Again, he then backed it up with a good Arizona Fall League. He's likely to return to AA to start the season next year, but with a hot start, he very well could find his way up in AAA, and he's a guy that could factor into the Mets bench. Probably not this season, but maybe as soon as 2027. The ability to add a guy that can not only catch and be a third catcher for your roster, but also can go out and can play some outfield. That's an interesting prospect and one that I'll be looking forward to watching across the upcoming season and certainly before that in spring training. The other guys that were invited to camp that are top prospects, you got Ryan Clifford, Jacob Reimer, and AJ Ewing. Right now in the Mets system, behind Carson Benge, those 3 are the best position player prospects the Mets have. Ewing is probably the best of that trio just because of the defensive ability to go out and play a good center field. Meanwhile, for Clifford, you're talking about him at first base or in a corner outfield spot. For Reimer, it's third base, and neither of those guys is carried by their gloves. They're both carried by their bats. So it'd be good to see those guys get a little bit of great league action, but none of them has a real chance to make the team. Outside of those 3 and Benge, the next guy up in the system behind maybe Chris Suero is Nick Morabito. And so Morabito is another top prospect to watch in camp for the first time, but he's not a non-roster invite. Morabito was Rule 5 draft eligible, so the New York Mets protected him from the Rule 5 in November and added to the 40-man roster. So he will be there, but I don't think he has a chance to make the team. I think he is very likely heading to Syracuse to start his season. When it comes to the pitchers, Jack Wenninger and Ryan Lambert are the 2 pitching prospects who got non-roster invites. For Wenninger, you're talking about right now, I think the 3rd best pitching prospect in the Mets system and a guy that I wouldn't be surprised if they viewed him as starting pitching depth for the upcoming season in the big leagues. I think he would fall behind Jonah Tong and Christian Scott in that regard, but he's going to be in a rotation with them in Syracuse to start the season, and there's absolutely a chance that Wenninger can make his way up and debut with the Mets in 2026. Lambert, on the other hand, throws fuel. Not that Wenninger doesn't. Wenninger actually has been adding velocity to his fastball, but Ryan Lambert out of the bullpen can touch over 100 miles per hour. He needs to learn how to harness that velocity, that stuff. His walk rate last year, once he got to AA, was 15% or just shy of that, 14.7. So that is a very high walk rate, and that's not easy to sustain in the big leagues. But his strikeout rate was 36.2%. So if he can keep the strikeouts and minimize the walks, or even take some of the strikeouts down, but minimize the walks, I mean, this is a guy that can absolutely be in the bullpen this year. And if he has just a bonkers good camp, you might see him breaking the opening day roster. I think that's pretty unlikely because I think he still should see AAA before he gets to the big leagues. But sometimes with a guy that has stuff as good as Ryan Lambert, they might force your hand. So we'll see if he does that for the Mets this this spring training. No longer the off season. Got to stop saying off season. Got to get into spring mode. And now we'll go through the minor league deals that the Mets have signed throughout the off season who were invited to camp. You got Robert Stock and Brandon Waddell, who are your NRIs that are listed as starting pitchers for Stock. At 35 years old last year, he pitched with 3.92 ERA and 85 innings played, or 85 innings pitched, I should say, in AAA with the Red Sox. Waddell had a 3.45 ERA with the Mets last season and 31 1/3 innings pitched. Was a very valuable arm for them. Because he's now out of options, going to be a little bit harder for him to make a real big impact on the big league club. Now, tomorrow, I want to spend more time focusing in on the Mets bullpen, and I'll really dive into the numbers on all these non-roster invites and give you a couple of names that I really like. But to just list them all off now, you got Craig Kimbrell, who signed to a split contract very similar to MJ Melendez. You got Carl Edwards Jr., who has been in the league for a very long time as a very successful sort of middle relief option, more than a leverage arm, but a guy that, again, has a lot of experience. Nick Birdie. You have Joe Jocks. You have Anderson Severino. You have Kevin Herget, who's back for another year. He was with the Mets last season. I mentioned Lambert already. You got Adbert Azale, who was the closer for the Cubs before he needed Tommy John, and definitely a name to watch in camp. Mike Baumann, Daniel Duarte, Nate Lavender, who had a great camp for the Mets a couple years back, ended up getting selected by the Rays in the Rule 5 draft, I believe despite the fact that he had Tommy John surgery. So he rehabbed with the Rays. They decided they prefer the 40-man roster spot, so they let him go and returned him back to the Mets. I will be very curious to see what he looks like in spring because he was the guy that just talked about the way he competes a couple years ago in spring and really got a lot of fans quickly. I love to see that story come full circle, and he actually makes the team this time around. The last guy is Matt Turner. So you have, when you list out all of those options, as well as the guys who are on the 40-man roster already that are fighting in camp, you're talking about 20 guys who are competing for maybe at most 4 spots in that bullpen. And Tobias Myers is one of those 20, and he has an inside track as the long man. So you could have as many as 19 guys competing for 3 spots. If you have a 6-man rotation, that can drop to 2 spots. So that's going to be a fun one to watch all throughout spring, just to see which of these guys is standing out in their work. And we'll also see, who gets, taken off the roster through the cuts throughout the offseason. That's always part of the intrigue at following along, is getting to see, all right, the Mets made their first round of cuts. Let's see which 10 guys are getting reassigned to the minor leagues. And you just see that roster whittle down further and further. We already saw, I guess, a little bit of a difference to the 40 as Reed Garrett was added to the 60-day IL when the Mets picked up Hudson. You can see more of that in the coming days and weeks of guys getting transferred to the 60-day IL. You have Daniel Nunez, who should be over there. You have Tyler McGill. So you can clear up a couple more roster spots if you're going to make more transactions, or for just the guys that compete for and win a job out of camp. So that is it for today's show. Again, a long list of players to go through, and we can't really do it on one fell swoop. So I am going to spend some time here on tomorrow's show, likely barring any news that'll come out of camp, where we will dive a little bit deeper into some of those NRIs, as well as the guys that are, on the 40-man roster competing for a spot in the bullpen. And I'm going to make a prediction on what the bullpen will be on opening day, a prediction that will undoubtedly end up being wrong because it's one of the hardest things to predict, is what a bullpen is going to look like at the end of spring training between injuries and just a line of decision-making that you can never quite exactly follow. I think this year, because there's not the long list of guys that don't have options, I think this will give you a little bit better of a spirit of competition where everybody is, for the most part, on a level playing field, where all these guys are competing and there's nobody that has an edge just based on their standing on the roster in relation to the options. So anyway, that's going to be all again for this edition of Locked On Mets. I appreciate all of you for tuning into the show. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listener, your first watch every day. Now for your second watch, check out Locked On MLB, breaking down all the latest in Major League Baseball. Sully does a great job. You can find Locked On MLB wherever you find Locked On Mets.